Welcome to the Achieve Workplace Culture podcast, where Wendy, Chris, and Eric explore the latest news stories, their work, and trends for creating and maintaining a healthy workplace culture.
Welcome to the Achieve Workplace Culture podcast, where we make Wendy laugh when we start off our podcast.
Sorry, I can't stop thinking about the fact that my pen matches your shirt.
All right.
Keep that in. Keep that in.
Welcome to the Achieve Workplace Culture podcast, where we talk about all things related to workplace culture. I'm Eric Stutzman, one of your hosts today, and I'm here with my good friends, Wendy Lowen and Chris Downey. How are you two doing today?
I'm doing excellent. It is spring. The sun is out, and that just puts me in the right headspace. I had a meeting first thing this morning, and I walked out of the coffee shop, sun shining down. It's hard not to do well when it's like that, so I'm doing good.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, I feel really energized today. We're recording this podcast on a Friday. I'm looking forward to the weekend, getting out. My husband and I have planned a bike ride when I get back home. And Chris and I last night were out at Gala Award. And Chris presented an award on behalf of Achieve, a leadership and training award to a particular organization and an individual who's done outstanding work. So I just feel really energized by the good work that's being done by us and also by the people we work with.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun last night for sure.
Yeah, I agree about the spring and we've had a lot of sunshine and the longer days with the sunshine and the warming weather. It's hard not to feel positive right now. It's really good. So each episode of our podcast, we talk about a current article or a topic related to workplace culture that's got us thinking. This time, we're going to talk about changing cultures, changing the culture of overwork in particular. And then we're going to have a couple of rants and raves to share with each other and our audience. And as always, we're going to end our podcast with some actionable items or takeaways that you can use in your workplace, hopefully right after you listen to this. So Wendy, why don't you set us up with the main topic for today?
Yeah, we're going to be looking at an article called How to Fix Your Company's Culture of Overwork by Melissa Clark out of Harvard Business Review. It was published in March, and it's a fantastic article. She talks about the growing unhealthy relationship that people in general are experiencing with work. And she outlines 3 things that organizations, leaders should be thinking about if they want to address that particular issue in their culture, in their workplace. So she outlines 3 areas. First of all, we should assess, figure out, do we actually have a culture of overwork? Do we have a what is our baseline? Second, we need to think about and plan for some kind of change, incremental change. And lastly, she talks about executing on that change, learning from it, and then iterating and coming back to assessing where we're at. So I think the article gives lots of points for conversation in terms of the points that she's outlined in terms of assessing and changing and learning from the change, but also the broader conversation around where we are in our workplace and how we believe what place work plays and how overwork is actually causing a level of stress and dysfunction for a lot of people.
I thought it was kind of interesting. She starts by making the case that during the pandemic,
Right.
we got used to working at home and kind of working whenever we feel like it. And so the prevalence of emails sent after typical office hours went up, more emails happening in the evenings and other times. And now post-pandemic, that hasn't actually changed. It hasn't gone back to the way it was before. So she makes the case that it's worse than it was before the pandemic. I don't know if that's, I don't know how to verify that or through my own experience. But it's an interesting idea that it's actually gotten worse. I don't know if you've seen that, Chris or Wendy.
I noted that in the article. It's interesting. It was kind of like, I agree. This was an issue before the pandemic. Either way. The pandemic might have put a bit of a spotlight on it, but I'm not convinced it's just a pandemic thing. I think one of the things, I think the article was interesting. I think the topic is really interesting. And I think what we're dealing with in the workplace is an artifact of our culture as a whole. And it's a culture of busy. Just think about it. When you talk to anybody, how are you doing? What's one of the answers you hear the most?
Oh, I'm busy.
Busy. Got so much on the go. I've got this. That's how we operate in culture. I think what we're seeing in the workplace is and this is just a thought, a bit of a manifestation of sort of what we've become socially, at least in our part of the world anyway. I'm curious as to what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, I mean, the article cites 200% increase over the pandemic in terms of email exchanges.
Right.
And I think what I took away from that piece is that this was a problem before the
Okay.
pandemic. The pandemic exacerbated it, but now we've normalized that. And I mean, I thought about this from a personal level. We were working double time, just trying to figure out how we were going to manage the pandemic as a training organization. And the truth is, I did work a lot of hours in the evening, on the weekend. I mean, part of it was there wasn't a whole lot else
Sure.
to do.
Yeah.
I was bored and I was incredibly grateful for work. But the shift coming out of that, I think, has been, I mean, on a personal level, if I'm like completely transparent, that's been a little bit difficult. I even for myself normalized that. We set up a home office that was beside our bedroom. I would get up in the morning and sometimes I just turn the computer on before I would go shower. And then 2 hours later, I'm still sitting there in my pajamas working on my computer.
Right.
And I think that's a very unhealthy pattern that people now we've gone to hybrid and remote working arrangements. I think a lot of those ways of being and working and constantly on, we're slow to shift out of those.
But Wendy, you
Mm.
I know personally, like you've talked about how you're trying to reimagine the way you do your evenings. You're trying to set
Yes.
some specific limits, and I think that's interesting. So we got an article here about a culture of overwork. We should be thinking about our own organization and the culture that we have here that we see around in other organizations. And yet it's very personal, especially for you that you've been talking about it, right?
Very much so. And I think if we're going to address overwork, and Chris, in our pre conversation, you talked about the organizational culture and how it can't be a one size fits all.
Mhm.
And I think there's layers to addressing overwork. There's the personal work that I need to do, there's the work on a team in terms of how they're managed, but then there also is the larger umbrella of the culture of our particular workplace around
Mm-hmm.
overwork.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction you talk about. Is you went to right there. You've had to be making some personal decisions, and even you said there's some unhealthy habits that you refer to them as unhealthy, and they might be for you, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's unhealthy for somebody else to have that office next door. That might be incredibly healthy and might serve them really well. And I think
Yeah.
that's one of the things we're a bit at risk at right now when we're rethinking things. We're making assumptions that this habit that might not be good for me, well, therefore it's not good for everybody else. Maybe, but it could be. So I think that we need to be considering both the personal and what is the organization requiring, but what do people need? I think it's the combination of both we need to be considering.
Yeah, we
So-
can't policy it. We can't prescribe it to be a certain way, like no emails after a particular, working hours are done. So no one's allowed to do any work. No one's allowed to email.
But are you sure? Like, why couldn't we? I mean, I know, Chris, you're saying that maybe it's good for somebody or maybe not for somebody else, but I know I've more than once read a reference to an organization, I believe in Germany, that has been very clear.
Regimented
no
around it.
emails after 5 p.m. and no emails on the weekend. And they just shut it off. You can't do that. So, I mean, that's an extreme end of a
Sure.
spectrum, but they're trying to address what they see as a systemic problem. And so let's step back a little bit.
Sure.
Let's step back a little bit and say, well, what is overwork and why is that a problem? Like, why is that a problem in the first place? Why should
Yeah.
we even talk about this
Sure.
on our podcast?
Yeah, and the article defines overwork as the inability to disconnect from work.
Yes.
And I think that's important. There are times when, we do our work after hours and it's actually invigorating because that's when we feel the inspiration. But it's I think the expectation that we are constantly on and constantly responding. And I do think there's a difference between, someone who's a manager or a leader sending an email or someone who is working after hours. I feel like that's different because people do check especially if you're new in an organization and you want to prove yourself, or you're working remotely and you don't want to be invisible. So you're checking your email on a regular basis to make sure that you're, creating not just the image, but that you are doing good work in the eyes of your manager or your leader. And so I think that there's multiple things at play here, that it's okay to work after hours if that works for you and you're inspired. But as a leader or a manager, it should not be the expectation.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder, I mean, actually, I like the definition, the inability to disconnect from work. Hard stop. Right? If you don't have the ability to disconnect, I could see that being problematic. But when you choose to disconnect, I see that as an individual choice. Right? So I think there is a difference. If someone's working in the evening or they're working on a weekend, that might be all right, provided they're in control of that. They have personal agency around that. But if they have an inability to disconnect because there's pressures to stay connected, that's where I see it becoming a problem. I think this isn't, it's having that inability to disconnect. I think there's something to that.
I think it's on two levels.
Sure.
It's an individual level,
Yep.
the
Yep.
inability to disconnect, but there can also be a pervasive culture around the expectation to be constantly on.
Yeah. And it's interesting because disconnecting from work is something that means different things in different kinds of companies and organizational contexts. If I work in a manufacturing facility and I am responsible for making something, disconnecting from work for me might be easy, unless I've got a toxic workplace culture around me and all I'm thinking about is my jerk of a boss or my jerk of a colleague. So what are we disconnecting from? Because I know I have a good friend, somebody that we've worked with before, who has said, disconnecting, like work-life balance, what's that mean, right? It's just balance. Do I have life balance? And disconnecting from work isn't necessarily a goal for everybody, because maybe I really love thinking about work. Maybe that's where my heart and passion is. And I think it differs depending on where you are in an organizational structure too, and whether you're responsible for programs and development or whether you're responsible for answering phones. It's just, I think, to me, it's the second part of the definition that I found more compelling, when it is intrusive. Maybe you could reread that again, Wendy, the part, the inability to disconnect and it causes something.
Yeah, when work dominates your thoughts and your activities to the detriment of other aspects of your life.
Right. If this is like getting in the way of me leading a fulfilling life that is in addition to my work, that I think is a problem.
I 100% agree. And I think that's what we need to get to really, it is, whether you mentioned it being a personal or an individual thing and a systemic issue as well. So I agree. We need to be mindful that we don't take away someone's ability to connect, because we might be pulling away something that's really important to them at that point, which might have a detriment to their life. Right. So I understand the logic here is, overwork could lead to this, but removing that connection could also be detrimental as well. So I think it is having the ability to disconnect when you need to and connect when you need to versus just a straight disconnection.
So an element of choice to it.
Choice,
right? Where's the choice?
That's exactly right.
The choice, because work might be my safe and happy place. Home might not be.
Right.
Maybe I want to. It makes me feel good. So interesting. So the culture of overwork that creates some sort of detriment to my ability to function well in the other aspects of my life. That's what we're really talking about here, right?
Yep.
And
So Chris, around what you said about the choice, and what is the leader's role in that?
Well, I mean, I think the leader's role is really, really important here, because I like, Eric, your friend, that idea that it's just having a balanced life, however that person defines a balanced life. And I think we need to perhaps rethink how we approach work and the employee experience, and even that relationship between a leader and their employee. A leader that's really connected with their employee knows how they're doing.
Yeah.
How are you? And not just how are you doing on this project, but how are you doing? So if Wendy, if I'm working with you and I work for you, we have a good relationship, you have a sense of how I'm doing overall, right? So maybe I'm working on the weekend. In fact, we actually had this happen at one point. We were doing a project together, and we just to give some background for the listeners, we were working on a project that required a fairly lengthy report. And I was working from home, and I just got on a tear. And I had no one, the family was away, and I just put my head down and I just I worked till probably 2 o'clock in the morning. I was like inspired, produced this report. I remember I hit send. I went to bed. I felt great. And the next morning, I got a message back from you, Wendy, acknowledging the time. And I remember having to say, no, I was good with that. The only difference was I needed to make the decision that, no, I've already worked today. So the next morning I said, I'm going to take it easy
I'm
for
not
a
going
little
to.
while.
Yeah.
But there was nothing wrong in that moment with, in fact, it was productive work, but I also, on a personal level, I felt really good. So although it was 2 o'clock in the morning, I felt fulfilled. I felt balanced to that point. So if someone is observing that, they might go, well, that's unhealthy, but it was very, very healthy for me in that moment. And just to be clear, I don't work till 2 o'clock all the time. In that moment, though, it made sense.
Chris, and I think your example touches on how we define the word productivity. And Eric, you talked about working in a manufacturing firm. It's very easy to define productivity then, right?
Right.
You've got this many widgets you've produced at the end of
Yeah.
your shift. And then if you've met that, you're done. But if you're a knowledge worker, you're working on a report like you and I were,
Mm-hmm.
there's a different kind of productivity that's attached to it. And there needs to be, you talked about taking the next day and giving yourself some breathing room. There needs to be that ability to exhale and to regenerate yourself so you can come back in and be quote unquote productive.
So let's get back to the article for a minute. The article starts off with the title. Let's see if I can grab the article here. How to Fix Your Company's Culture of Overwork.
Right.
The title itself makes the assumption that if overwork is a problem, overwork is a problem because people can't shut down, enjoy the rest of their life. It's getting in the way. How then do you know
Right.
if you've got a culture of overwork? What does that look like? Because let's go back to your example, Chris. You worked at 2 a.m.
Mm-hmm.
You send an email message to your colleague, Wendy, who's
Right.
on a similar level in the organization to you. What if you sent that to somebody who is very junior, new, younger, maybe reports to you? Does that influence culture in a way now that might not be positive?
Yeah, I certainly think it can. And I think, thanks for bringing us back, Eric, on this to the article. It was a potential culture of overwork. And I do think there is the individual and there's the organizational side of things. I think we need to be mindful when you asked the question about the leader's role in the signals and the messaging that we are sending. So I think that's important because you're right. I could have been a manager and I sent it off at 2 o'clock in the morning to a new employee. Now they're thinking, oh, geez, I guess this is an expectation. So I might be setting an expectation unknowingly, but I'm doing that. I think we need to be mindful of that. But let's go back to this. How do you know if you have a culture of overwork? It's a great question. And I think it comes back to, do people feel that they have the ability to disconnect when they need to or not?
Yes.
If they don't, it's a culture of overwork. If they do, you're probably doing okay. The question is, how do you find out if people have that ability to disconnect or not, or feel that they have the ability to do it? And that, to me, is about leaders being connected with their employees. And then and also the organization having a good sense of what's going on there.
Sure. So our author here, Melissa, says that we should do an assessment. We should hire an outside firm to come in and do an assessment to really understand our current state. If we think there's a culture of overwork, we should do it. Is that necessary?
I put a question mark when I read that. I thought, maybe in a large corporation, there might be the need to bring somebody else in. But for the most part, the direct manager should be paying attention to their team, should be asking those questions, should know what the level of work is and what the expectations are. I think that the people in this room, we don't need an outside consultant to come in and tell us if we have a culture of overwork. If there's safety within our team, psychological safety, that people can come forward. I mean, prior to the podcast, I had someone pop into my office and they had a question about a contract they were working on. And I said, hey, can I just ask a few questions of you? And I asked about, do you think we have a culture of overwork? And I said, I know I'm putting you on the spot. And she responded, no, I don't think we do. But we have a very safe relationship.
Right.
She said, I do think we have seasons where we're all overworked.
Yeah, right.
But we know that there's an ebb and a flow to the bulk of work that's coming in.
Yeah. So yeah, well, I don't fully disagree with what you're saying.
Just partially.
Yeah. Well, no, I partially do, because the idea with the assessment, I mean, I agree, absolutely, leaders need to stay connected. That's important. I'm always ringing that bell, right? But sometimes we can be too close, and then we can lose sight of, just think about your own health, right? Sometimes it makes sense to just kind of take a bit of inventory. Are the things that I'm doing really what's best for me or not? Is this really some of my best choices? So I think the assessment isn't a bad thing. And that could be done externally. That could also be done internally, depending on your organization and the size. But I think what's key is, what do you then do with the results of the assessment? Because if you just assess and then start making decisions based off of that, I think you're at risk. Because often assessments then become filled with assumptions, and that's when we start to get a bit off. An example could be, maybe the assessment says that we have lots of people working after hours. Okay, is that a problem? Often people say, yeah, that's a problem. Is it though? We don't know. Let's talk about that. That's when we then connect with staff.
What does that actually mean?
What does that mean? Let's give meaning to that assessment. And then we modify our behavior, our policies, our processes based off of that. But so I'm all for the assessment. The assessment is just data. Then we need to connect with employees and give that data meaning, and then we can determine what we actually have a problem.
The data creates discussion rather than a prescriptive approach
Yeah.
forward. And I would say Melissa Clark here is clear about that too. One of the things she really emphasizes in this article is that we take time to discuss.
Sure.
Right? And it's not information flowing from senior management. This is what we're going to do. We've got a culture of overwork, so everybody needs to stop this. Instead, it's assess and discuss. Just like you're saying, Chris, that's one of the key points of this article that I found actually really, really helpful, thoughtful. Chris, you were talking about how you find personally an ability to work when you're inspired or want to is helpful. And I think, Wendy, that's for you similar, although you also have said recently in our conversations, I also need to set boundaries and say, I actually am going to shut off for this period of time. I know for me, my whole work life, I have worked hard till the end of whatever the workday is, and then normally mostly shut off in the evenings. And I always felt a little bit bad about that, thinking, well, if I was really a great leader, if I was a great employee, I would just be willing to work more in the evenings. But I remember working back in the early 2000s for an organization. I got my first BlackBerry. And I remember going home at the end of the day and taking it and putting it on the upper shelf in the closet behind things, where I wouldn't see it and I wouldn't hear it, so that I could actually disconnect, because it was a crackberry for me, right? I could just look at it all the time. And I knew that the next day I would not be happy. I would not have slept well. I would not be able to focus well. So sometimes I'm really happy to sit down at 7:30 in the evening when my kid's at her acro course, and I can sit there and just work on something. But a lot of times I like to shut down. And I've read multiple times over the last couple of years, in fact, we might have discussed it on an earlier podcast, that about 50% of people like to work flexibly whenever it works for them. And about 50% find that really problematic and like prescribed hours. And so we should just know that, like you're saying, working in the evening isn't a sign of overwork. The sign of overwork is people saying, I'm overwhelmed. I can't sleep. I can't focus on the other things that matter to me. I feel a constant expectation that's leading me to burn out. That, to me, is what the problem is not when you're working. It's how you're feeling at the end of the day.
I want to just say something, because I think this is an important thing. In your story, Eric, you mentioned earlier in your career, and you were quite disciplined about shutting off, and you felt bad about that.
Yeah, I did.
Let's stop on that for a moment.
Okay.
What do we celebrate and recognize? Just, I'll say, in our society.
Yes.
Why would it be that you would, after a hard day's work, and I've worked with you, you do work hard in the time that you're committed to it, that you would feel guilty about not? What messaging? And that's beyond the organization, let's be honest.
Yeah, it is a bit of both. The organizational leaders in that organization they were like, yeah, we work 50, 60 hours a week, but we can take some flexible time the next day. And I knew they were working evenings. I knew they were like driving out to meet clients at all odd hours of the day. And so I felt like maybe I wasn't measuring up. So there's that. But then there's Yeah, like, I mean, even movies and TV shows, like the people working in the evening and then they're driving fancy sports cars because they're making a lot of money because they're working in the evening or whatever.
Right.
I don't know.
You know,
But
it's true
it's
though.
cultural
We
messages.
celebrate that. Think about
We
it. When you get
do.
together with people, they often talk about, oh man, I've been working around the clock, and we celebrate.
So busy.
And I want to be clear, celebrate effort without question and commitment, all that sort of stuff. But are we really celebrating, I'll say, the right things?
Exactly.
And what messaging are we sending? And I think that there's something. Go ahead, Wendy.
I think that's like the curated version, the Instagram version of work.
Right.
What it means to be productive at work. We're
Yes.
creating
Time.
this sort of image around the hustle culture and productivity.
Yeah.
And I'm reading a great book by Cal Newport called Slow Productivity. And he said it's actually pseudo productivity. It's not real productivity. And productivity is like how many products you can produce at the end of, your shift.
Right.
Well, for many of us, we're knowledge workers, and we need time to do deep work, not just get through the checklist of things that are there.
Yeah. So Cal Newport's book is one take on that. His book, Productivity.
Yeah.
I think you even brought it along. You could hold it up for the
Oh,
camera so
yeah,
that people who
absolutely.
are watching this podcast can see it.
It arrived last week, and I haven't read it yet, but I have flipped through it. I mean, and his basic premise is do less actually, so that you can do deep work on the things that you're doing. Work at a natural pace. Chris, you talked about that. Work when you can, and even in the rhythm of an organization when things are busy, and obsess about quality. It's not just about getting through things as quickly as you can. It's about doing really good work.
Deep focused work. I heard him interviewed recently on the Tim Ferriss podcast. It was an excellent show. If our listeners are looking for other podcasts, listen to Tim Ferriss and Tim Ferriss's interview with Cal Newport, which happened probably in March of 2024 sometime. So that's a great episode. The other book that I think about on this topic, so Antidote to Overwork, Rest.
Yes.
Like, how do we rest? Do our employees feel the capacity to rest? Do we celebrate rest in the same way we celebrate productivity? One of my favorite books of the last year was Rest, Why You Get More Done When You Work Less. And I found that to be a fabulous book. And one of the things they talk about is that rest cannot be separated from work. Rest is integral to high quality, productive work. Without rest, we actually don't think as deeply and as creatively. We need rest for our brains to be creative. And it's not really just the culture of overwork and long hours doesn't actually lead to greater success. It leads to declining creativity and declining productivity.
I agree. I think there's history here that's informing this. We've been for a long time recognizing and reinforcing long hours.
Yes.
Right. We've been rewarding that. I'm thinking back now to I was managing a team of supervisors, and the decision had been made that the supervisors were going to get moved into salaried positions. And our HR team at the time reviewed the overtime that I had 3 supervisors that were working, and then gave recommendations to what their salary should be based off of that. And the breakdown was 2 of the supervisors worked an incredible amount of overtime. So they said they should be paid X, which was about 30% higher than the recommendation for this other person who didn't work any overtime.
Oh my.
And I remember looking at that. This is when I started rethinking things. When I looked at all 3 supervisors, and they were going to pay the recommendation, they were asking me to validate this. I took a look at it. It was the one that works less overtime, we should pay was 20 or 30% less. I said, they are far and away the most efficient. It was, in this case, it was a new mother, would come in early and would just bust it right through the shift, and by 3 gone, so much done. The other 2 were hard workers. They stretched it out. And I remember actually having to challenge that. I think they actually should be making, if anyone should be making more, it's actually this person who's working less. But they were just very disciplined about how they worked. And I think part of this is, let's acknowledge the fact that historically we've looked at work as being the more hours, the more you're working. This article actually talks about, since the pandemic, we have all of this new technology that's available to us, which is good. There's a lot of benefits to it. But what we haven't done is really blown up what we think work is. And I think in order to get through this, because I do agree, it is a challenge. We really need to rethink the whole experience of work, not just bits and pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. And, to your, you're talking about what do we reward or celebrate? Think about how we pay overtime. Time and a half you get paid if you work overtime. So you get paid more. So these people who were not as productive got rewarded financially for stretching out their hours, while the person who was more productive and kept it within got paid less. Even before they went to salary, right? This is just, it's wrong.
Right. This is the system that we have built in work to reward that.
Well, and when you think about coming out of an industrial society where a boss might say you have to now stay to the 9th hour and the 10th hour and the 11th hour.
Agreed.
Yeah, we need to pay more because the company is saying you have to do it, and it's stressful and hard on you to do it.
Yes.
But if you're just making a choice to stay longer because that's the way you like to work, why are we paying you more, right?
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Well, and the research backs that up. The article highlights that there isn't it's a very weak correlation between the number of hours worked and feeling overworked. It has to do with the inability to disconnect and the expectations that you're constantly on. And that's where I think it links to culture and how we set up our organization and what we expect and what we communicate about being on, getting work done, getting through 50 things in a day, as opposed to doing quality, deep work.
Well,
I think that's where culture comes in.
What you're saying reminds me of a related conversation, which is what do you value? And what does the organization value? What does the organization want for its employees? What experience do you want them to have? What kind of lives do you want them to be able to lead as a result of their work?
Right.
Yeah. And I think we talk a lot about productivity, and I'm just rethinking that word in and of itself. It's like, is that really what we want? Or is it engagement? That deep work, being satisfied, contributing to the purpose of your organization. Thinking about the long term, not just, what we get done today, but how are we contributing in a month, in a year, as opposed to, I got to get through my list today.
Right. Let productivity be the result or the output of that. I think this is important because I think let's go back to it. How do you fix the company culture of overwork? I think, Eric, you're on to this, and Wendy, you're right. It has everything to do with culture. Given what business you're in, what you're there to do, whatever difference you're there to make in the world, what sort of culture do you need in order to realize that?
Right.
Make sure you, with intention, understand that, because this is what can happen. You often, and right now we do so much work. We consult in so many different sectors. I don't know about you. I have yet to have met a leader in any sector that said, I want to overwork my people.
Yeah, right.
I want to grind them down. No one leader is saying that, yet the system they're working within is sending those messages. And I think when we think about our culture, we want to think about, with intention, what sort of culture we need to support what we're trying to accomplish.
Yes.
And we also need to, and this is where we want to stay connected with what is our true culture. And one of the things that came up actually through doing a culture assessment is, how do you define your culture and what you really value? Someone said, it's what we tolerate. And that was really interesting for me to think about, because we could say we value work-life balance and we want people to disconnect. But yet we actually tolerate people not disconnecting, working excessive overtime. So I think what we want to do is be intentional about the culture that we need, stay connected with it, but be mindful on what are we really allowing to happen. And then this is where one of the things we always talk about, curiosity being a critical thing, then being curious when we are seeing perhaps increases on the weekends. Let's be curious about that. Let's find out what's going on. So I think it is all to do with culture.
Yeah, it's really, I feel like that's a takeaway for us and for our listeners to ask ourselves that question: what do we tolerate?
What do we tolerate?
Because it gives you some insight into what you're valuing and the messages that you're sending, the true messages you're sending. If what you tolerate is different than what you talk about, that's a problem.
Yeah.
That's a real problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do we tolerate?
We're thinking.
So I want to create incredible value for our customers and clients, the people we work with. At the same time, I want to create an experience of, I feel valued for our employees, and our employees feel they're contributing to valuable things,
Right.
and that they are doing so in a way where they can experience wellness as a result of their work, meaning, connection as a part of their work. That's what I really want.
Mhm.
I don't really, and if somebody wants to work on a weekend once in a while because that makes them happy, I'm going to look over at our producer over there behind the camera. I got an email from Scott on a long weekend where Scott was brainstorming about something. It's like, why? He's sending me an email on the weekend, on Sunday, long weekend. And then I went, but wait a minute. I think this just made Scott really happy to do that work. And in fact, when I asked him about it later the next week, yeah, he was excited. So if that's what Scott wants to do once in a while, as long as Scott's experiencing wellness and feeling that that's meaningful and is connected and can disconnect when he wants, then I'm happy about that.
Yeah, I think that comes back down to what we talked about earlier. It's having the ability to disconnect, or the sense that you have that ability to disconnect. And I think as a connected leader in that moment, you might notice, well, this came in over the weekend. Be curious about that.
Yeah.
Follow up. Now you could have that conversation. Scott, we're just making this up as we go along. And Scott maybe says, yeah, I was just really inspired. I wanted to get that out. Excellent. There's no problem here. Or maybe it's like, really overwhelmed. It's been a really rough few weeks. Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't know that. Thanks for sharing that. What do you need?
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's about being connected with what the needs of the employee are in those moments, and being curious about it, and not making broad assumptions. There's a risk to that. Oh, Scott just he gets inspired on the weekends. That's why he does it. If we don't talk about it, then we can't. We need to confirm those assumptions, I think, which is so important.
Right. There's the shift judgment, curiosity. Okay, we see this behavior. What does the behavior mean? And realize you don't know. You have to set aside your own assumption and ask a question. Let's get really practical now. Let's imagine our listeners think that they have a culture of overwork where people are not really disconnecting in ways that are healthy or not feeling like they're able to. Let's name like 1, 2, 3, 4 things that you can do to figure that out and to take steps to correct a culture that isn't as healthy as you would want it to be?
I think that's a really good question. When you said that, I was thinking about our paint night. The idea that as a staff, you do things outside of work to celebrate things that are not just about sitting at your desk and getting the task done, that you appreciate the larger context of what people are contributing and to coming together.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you suggesting our listeners have a paint night, or are you suggesting
that we connect with people, that we do things as a team and as a staff that isn't just about brainstorming, meeting, planning, executing on work?
So we show that there's value to simply being together and doing something creatively different, and we give people those kind of options. I feel like the point is really good, right? And can we connect with each other and show that other things are valued besides productivity?
Yeah. I think let's look at 2 different things, because I think for listeners, that for takeaways, what can leaders or organizations do to address these challenges that they present? But it's also, what can individuals do?
Yes.
Because don't get me wrong, there's no question that there are cultures that celebrate work and do grind people and burn them out. But in some cases, I know I've been there, I put pressure on myself due to my experiences and all those sorts of things. So I think let's start first with the organizations, and then we'll talk about individuals. I think with organizations and leadership in particular, I think this is it. Question the assumptions that you're making about your employees' working habits.
Yes.
Even if it's for the positive. Someone's been really consistent and they're super reliable, and you've created a whole narrative about them. Good work ethic, come from good stock. How are they doing with this? Mm-hmm. So question those assumptions for the positive or the negative. So it's not just the negative assumptions. Question those assumptions and then seek clarity around those assumptions to make sure that people are there. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, to me, it feels like anything like that needs to be a bit, we need to think about that structurally. In an organization that's more than 7 or 8 people, there's going to be levels of leadership. And so if a senior leadership group is thinking about culture and overwork, they need to then connect with managers and say, do you know how people are feeling and experiencing work? Have you asked recently? Have you been curious about that? So there's some initiative toward curiosity that gets spread through all the leadership.
Yeah, and don't overlook the workers that appear to be doing well. Because so often we're like, oh yeah, but this person's struggling. But what about that person
Yes.
that's just been knocking it out of the park? And again, our assumption is they're doing great.
They
They
might
have a
not
smile
be.
on their face.
Right.
They might not be. Check
Right.
in with them on that for sure. Go ahead,
And,
Wendy.
well, and I'm thinking part of being a leader or a manager is realizing that I can sit in my office and I can have an idea. And because of our interconnectivity and Slack and email, I have an idea and I can shoot it off to Scott or Chantel. And it's been 10 seconds in my head, but I'm creating a whole new level of work for the person on the receiving end. That it's an idea, but for them, there's also, as soon as that happens, they've got to organize themselves. They've got administrative duties. They might have to pull in people for a meeting. And so I think it's very important that leaders take a step back and know what's on people's plates, not overload them, and have those conversations around, and even just recognizing that we're adding. Every time we have an idea and we put it out there, we're adding work to somebody's plate that might make them feel like they have to complete it right now as quickly as they can in order to be seen as being effective in their work.
Can I add something to that, Wendy? Because I think this is important. I think to that end is clarify your expectations as a leader. Because in many cases, we will send something off, could be a nice to do, don't need it for 3 weeks, but we don't say that. We just say, hey, can you run this report? Then it becomes a priority. So clarify expectations, whatever that expectation is. If it's something you need tomorrow, clarify that. If it's something that isn't a priority that we can look at next quarter, then just make sure those expectations are clarified. I think leaders often miss that. And that's where the pile on starts to happen. The people don't really know what the expectation is, and it becomes a priority. The higher up the organization you go, the more of a priority it becomes.
If you believe that your employees need to be able to disconnect in healthy ways from time to time, communicate that.
Right.
Yeah.
Be specific.
And lead by example.
Lead by example. If you believe that rest is important for creativity, take some rest and communicate about that.
Yes.
You said something really important, because I was thinking about this today. So we made a shift here as an organization to a 4.5 day work week some time ago. And I was thinking, when was the last half day that I took? And this is important.
Chris.
Yeah, yes. But this is what I realized. I stopped and went, wait a minute. Yeah, I haven't done that. And I don't mean, well, it was me. I hadn't stopped to think about it. But I also stopped to think, what message is that sending to people?
Yes.
Yeah.
I should really take that time, or at least make it clear that this is how I'm taking that time.
Yeah.
And here is the flip side. I want to go back now to the personal agency piece. That was me. I made that decision not to. The opportunity is there. So I think when we think about overwork, when we ourselves are feeling overworked, overwhelmed, ask ourselves this question and really be honest with ourselves. Is this my own expectation or someone else's? Am I putting an unnecessary, expectation on myself that hasn't really been, and oftentimes we are.
Yes.
And when you look at that list of 10 things that need to be done, okay, there's actually 2 here. The others are me.
Yeah.
And I really believe we actually have more control than we often feel that we do in our environments. Don't get me wrong, your culture can be very, very difficult, but even within that, what are you doing to contribute to your own overwork?
Yeah.
And you're doing something.
Yeah, Chris, as you're talking, I'm thinking about, I think his name is Nils van der Poel. He won like the speed skating Olympics in 2022. And he said his sort of thing that came to him as being able to be as successful as he was the idea of rest and disconnecting from work. And he said part of it was it gave him the ability to think about work, his training as I'm choosing this. And also, I mean, athletes know that, right? You need to have hard work, you need to have rest in order to do the hard tasks, the work to run, to race, to work that you want to do. And I think we sometimes forget that. I mean, I personally do. The busier I am, the longer and the harder I think I need to work, as opposed to saying, no, you actually need a break now.
You need a break and you need to choose to work. Let's wrap this up. The quick summary from our discussion that I'm seeing is your organization sending messages that are unhealthy? Are you clear about your expectations around disconnecting being a good thing? Are you providing space for that? Are you making sure your managers and your other leaders are doing that and being curious, asking, and then for us as individuals, examine our own assumptions about what's really required and necessary and how we can disconnect.
Yeah.
It's that time of the show where we get to the place where we get to talk a bit about something that made us happy related to the workplace culture, makes us want to shake our heads and say, really? Maybe we could do better than that. Rants and raves. So who wants to go first today?
I can jump on in.
All
I had
right.
a conversation just today with an individual who was sharing about the culture of overwork. And they basically said they are always behind. They're about 6 months behind because they constantly are being given new projects. You don't have to execute on them now, just add them to the bottom of your list. But they said that creates a feeling of it's never good enough. I can never catch up. And I feel very sad for that person that they actually can't disconnect from work, and the structure of the work itself is perpetuating that. And I think we can do better.
Yeah, agreed. I think it actually lines up with what we've been talking about today around expectations.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's so important. I think I've got a rant as well. I'm going to just throw this one out there. I was having a conversation this morning. Here's my rant. My rant is, for not having the conversation you need to have. So often people avoid having conversations because they're uncomfortable, they're difficult, but it leads to big issues down the line. I had a coaching session this morning that I've been engaged into it to deal with the situation that ultimately is a result of a conversation that didn't happen when it needed to happen. So my rant is, stop avoiding the conversations you need to have, because it's never going to get any easier than it is today. I get it. It could be difficult, but it's not getting any easier, and it's only going to make things worse. So have the conversation you need to have.
Absolutely. My favorite way of helping inspire people to have that conversation is to get them to count the cost first of having the conversation, the potential things that could go wrong,
Right.
and then count the cost of not having the conversation. And imagine a future 5 months from now when they haven't had it, and ask themselves, are they willing to bear that cost?
Oh, that's nice.
And all those things, because sometimes we need the motivation of, oh, if I don't do it, then what happens?
Right.
Because we don't usually count that side. When we do accurate cost accounting, it's sometimes motivating.
It's a great
and sometimes we just need skills and somebody to help us and some coaching. So I'm glad you could do that for that individual, Chris. I'm going to end with a bit of a rave. I am reading a book right now called Give and Take by Adam Grant. And the subtitle, Why Helping Others Drives Our Success. Somebody was at an education session sometime in the last couple of months where the presenter just put one of these on everybody's desk. Didn't talk about it, just gave everybody one of these books. I can't remember the name of the person that gave it to me, but I want to thank them because
I hope
this
they're
book,
listening.
Yeah, maybe they're a listener.
Maybe they are. And I know where to find the name. I just don't remember off the top of my head. Adam Grant is one of my favorite writers and thinkers right now. Adam Grant's all over the place, lots of books coming out. One of the things I love about the concepts in this book is that he defines, he says people tend to approach work in one of three ways of their relationships. They're either takers, like, what can I get out of this? What can I get? What can I get? Or in a transactional way, which is, I'll give you this if you give me that. You know, I'll work, you give me pay. I'll sit on your committee if you sit on my committee, as transactional. Or they're givers, which is, how can I create something, or how can I add value to something? And it's really inspired me to stop asking myself when somebody asks me to sit on a committee, well, what do I get out of that?
Yeah,
or
what's in it for me?
What's in it for me or the organization? And to start asking, what value could I bring to this? What could I give to this? Would that be worth it to giving? Because I know that when I approach my personal relationships, my friendships, and my work relationships from an attitude of what can I give or what can I bring, it creates joy for me and for others. And that's really what I want. I want a meaningful life where there's a lot of joy involved and where the world's getting better. And the irony is, Adam Grant has done tons of research and quotes all kinds of studies that show really the people who are giving, they make it to the top. The takers, as they try to climb their way to the top, end up getting punished by everybody else. Sometimes they end up in prison.
Right.
And so we should all be doing that. So let's think about our culture of overwork, and let's think about what we expect of our employees and ask ourselves, if we're an organizational leader, how can we bring something that's brings life to people? How can we give rather than take from our employees or transact with our employees? So that's what's
lovely.
inspiring.
That's
right now.
lovely. I mean, I love Adam Grant as well.
Mm.
And I heard him coin the term otherness, the idea that we should be focused rather than on ourselves. We should be looking to what we can provide for others.
Nice.
Yeah.
Very nice.
It's a profound shift, actually, in how we orient ourselves, even in our places of work.
Yeah, awesome.
Right.
Love that.
Well, I think that brings us to nearly the end of the show. Chris is going to give us some takeaways to walk out of here with, and so we'll leave that to you, Chris. And we'll, for Wendy and I, we're signing out. Over to you, Chris.
This idea of a culture of overwork, my mind's just spinning with this, and without question, this is a challenge for us right now. For I think in our society, but in various workplaces. So there was a few takeaways that came up that have really resonated with me that I want to summarize here. And the first is this: when you think about the messaging that you're sending as a leader, the culture that you want, what are you prepared to tolerate? Because what you're prepared to tolerate actually says more about your culture than what you claim is your culture. So if you're concerned about overwork in your workplace and people are overworking and you're tolerating that, you need to check that out. So first, what are you prepared to tolerate? The second is check your assumptions. And there's two ways I want to look at this. One is, as leaders, if you do have somebody that's doing really, really well, and maybe they're working extra hours and they seem to be doing well, what are your assumptions about that? Are they content? Are they happy? Or are you telling yourself they're content and happy? Check those assumptions, both positive assumptions and negative assumptions. We have a tendency to really be curious about when there's a challenge, but even when someone's doing well, check your assumptions about how your employees are doing and make sure you truly understand their perspective. Now, this is also important. If you feel as an individual that you're overworked, check your own assumptions. Are the expectations that you're striving to meet your expectations, or are they the actual expectations of your leader or the organization? What we often find is we put unnecessary expectations on ourselves, and sometimes that isn't helpful. So leaders, check your assumptions about your employees, but employees also check the assumptions of yourself as well. And the third piece, leaders, well, really anybody, clarify expectations. So if you put an ask to someone to complete a project, by when? Is this a high priority or is this a low priority? Make sure your expectations are clear, because oftentimes if we're sending out a request as a senior leader, it becomes a priority for the employee, even if it's not for us. So clarify those expectations. Because people want to meet your expectations, but they need to know what they are. So what are you prepared to tolerate? If you're tolerating something that's unacceptable, address it. Check your assumptions, both at an individual level and at a leadership level, and clarify those expectations, everyone. And one of the things that actually came up throughout our conversation today was, if you're concerned about your culture and you want to assess where it's at, that's something we do as an organization here at Achieve. In fact, we love doing that type of work. So if you are interested in assessing the health of your culture, reach out to us at theachievecenter.com. And just reach out. We'd love to talk to you about how we can help you out in that way. And while you're on that site, there's a couple things for you to take note of. We have a leadership certificate program happening in August. Check that out. That's a public offering. We also have a leadership retreat on July 18th and 19th, which I will be hosting out in Canmore. So if you're looking for a deep dive into leadership, please join me out in Canmore. We also have a free webinar on May 21st on leadership and culture, the pathway to organizational success, which Wendy and I will be facilitating. So that's the things that are up and coming, but do reach out to us if you're interested in learning more about cultural health assessments or anything else that we do. And that's at theachievecenter.com, and that's center, TRE at the end. So I want to thank you for listening. I know we have some listeners that consistently come back month after month. We appreciate your time commitment to listening. Stay connected with us. We want to know what you thought of today's podcast, but what's a subject you'd like to hear more about in the future? So we really love to hear from the listeners. Again, thank you. We appreciate you and looking forward to seeing you again next month.
Looking for free resources, training, and consulting in the areas of leadership and workplace culture? Be sure to check out achievecenter.com. That's achieve, CENTRE.com.